Here I am, Arctic Native Americans. We are cold, we are frigid, we are freezing. We're in the Arctic. We are in the Arctic Circle, which is above Russia, it's above Canada, it's above Alaska, it's above the United States. It's cold, and there's lots of ice around. And we're going to dive into the Native American tribes and the Native Americans of the Arctic region. It's first and foremost, natural resources. If you go to the Arctic, you're not going to see lots of trees. Why? Because the Arctic is above what is called the tree line. The tree line is an area of land where trees cannot grow because it is so cold. But you see driftwood here. Well, because there are so many forests in the Pacific Northwest and in western Russia, you'd have driftwood, which driftwood would be large logs that retain some air on the inside and had the ability to float along the ocean and rivers. And what happened was the Arctic Native Americans would catch these driftwood pieces. They would use them to make a shelter. They would use them to make a boat. They wasted nothing. Native Americans in North America were the first environmentalists. They took care of the earth, they didn't waste, and you most assuredly didn't have man-made global warming because of them. Next, you had lots of snow and lots of ice. So let's put two and two together. Let's make an igloo. Well, that's one of the biggest misconceptions about the Native Americans that lived in the Arctic, that they all lived in igloos all of the time. Well, you'd be all the time wrong if you thought that, because they used the igloo as a temporary shelter, whereas the Plains Native Americans used the teepee as a temporary shelter to accommodate them while they're on hunting expeditions. Well, they use their environment as well in the Arctic. They use blocks of ice. They would cut blocks of ice and they'd make an igloo, which is like a dome, which on the inside, if you made one well enough, you could keep the temperature around 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit at the coldest times, because it's like a big air bubble. And if you know anything about jackets, you have pockets of air, and air is an excellent insulator, and it insulates, it keeps in the warm air, and it keeps out the cold air. So, cold for preservation. You never had to worry about having a refrigerator if you're an Arctic Native American, because you lived in a refrigerator. And so all of the meat that you would catch, it would freeze, and if you needed to heat it up, you would start a fire and you'd heat it up that way. Dogs. Well, they domesticated dogs long ago, thousands of years ago, and dogs actually became a method of their transportation. Have you ever heard of sled dogs? Have you ever heard of the Iditarod? This is a development from what the Native Americans of the Arctic did long ago. Skins of polar bears, of elk, of caribou, and they would turn this into a leather, and they would have skins made out of that. But these weren't as plentiful as they were in the Great Plains with the buffalo. So they had skins, but not as much as other regions of the United States and North America at the time. Bones. You're thinking to yourself, dude, what can they do with bones? Well, I'm going to tell you. A whale is massive. A large whale can be as large as a school bus, okay? And so it needs a lot of structure to support itself. So the bones of a whale could be used to make a shelter out of. It's just as good as wood, just as hard as wood, and it lasts longer too. The only problem is bones of that size don't necessarily burn, so they're naturally fireproof. Unlike driftwood, which you could burn wood as a method of fuel. But speaking of fuel, you relied on whales to provide your means for fuel. You used blubber. And blubber is not the double chin that I currently have. No, blubber is a material that is like a fatty tissue that burns slowly. It was very efficient at burning. And long before they had gasoline or all these things to burn with, or kerosene, they used blubber. They used blubber to cook with. They used blubber to heat their homes, their permanent shelters. And then they had water. So they had many opportunities to fish and to capture marine life. Next, clothing. What kind of clothes would you wear if you lived in the Arctic? A lot of them. And the reason why, because it was so cold, dude. You'd wear parkas. You'd wear double layer pants, watertight boots, furs and skins. The Arctic Native Americans were not stupid. They're incredibly intelligent. They knew that as a means of survival, they needed to take care of their skin, they needed to take care of their body. So what they needed to do, they needed to dress appropriately if they're going to be out in the hazardous conditions that is the Arctic. Shelter, just like I talked about. Igloo is a temporary shelter. Temperatures could reach 61 degrees Fahrenheit inside the igloos. They're made of packed snow and ice bricks. You think of a brick as like something that has made your building that you're currently in. Well, these bricks were packed with little bitty tiny air bubbles that insulated the igloo and made it so comfortable for the Arctic Native Americans that this was a popular shelter while hunting, but not a permanent shelter. They were dome-shaped. The largest igloos could occupy up to 20 people. So can you imagine 20 people being on the inside of an igloo? It's quite amazing. Sod houses were used for permanent shelters. So sod is grass and earth that is like together, and they would they would use whalebones or driftwood, and they would make a structure that would be supported by sod. And sod is an excellent insulator, so it'd keep the heat in, keep the cold out, and it'd keep things comfortable within the shelter. And they also had a hole somewhere in the they couldn't necessarily have fires on the inside of igloos because the igloo would melt, but in the sod houses, it would provide a means of ventilation and also a means of the smoke being allowed to leave, because no one likes being in a smoky environment. Neither did they. They wanted smoke rises, so the smoke would rise north, and then they would provide a hole for it to do that. Where in the world would you find Arctic Native Americans? Well, they lived in Alaska, the Arctic, North Pole, Canada, Russia, and Greenland. But the cool thing is, you have many different tribes that live in these areas. It wasn't just the Inuit that lived in the Arctic. You had the Yupik and you had the Aleut. The Aleut lived along the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, which is a little bit south of Alaska, along the islands that stretch out into the Pacific Ocean. The climate, like we talked about, very cold. It was harsh, which meant not everyone could live there with the clothes that they had on. You had to adapt to survive there. They had long winters, short and cool summers, 10 to 25 centimeters of precipitation annually, which meant that borderline, it's almost a desert, which means that it gets very little precipitation annually. You're like, dude, like there's like snow everywhere and like ice everywhere. Yeah, it's been there for thousands of years. Okay. And so what I'm saying is that it doesn't rain often there, and it doesn't snow often. So the conditions are actually kind of arid and dry. All right, culture, lots of storytelling, lots of myths that they've carried along, like how they came to be there. It's oral tradition. They told it with their mouths, and they told their children over the course of many, many years. Singing, dancing, poetry, hunting, and religion. Transportation, as I talked about earlier, they use dog sleds. They use sleds that they just carried if they're carrying their tools for hunting. Kayaks, they're actually the inventor of the kayak. So if you go to a sports store where they're selling kayaks, no, they didn't invent the idea of a kayak. That would be Native Americans. And they walked. That'd be very uncomfortable walking on ice in the Arctic, but that is also why they manufactured and they made airtight, watertight snow boots. Keep the water out because nobody likes freezing toes. Physical features: mountains, ice-covered land, rugged terrain. So even if you had a sled, it was quite dangerous because I don't know about you, but it's kind of hard to take a sled across rocky terrain. So for some areas, you'd have flat areas of ice, and these Native Americans were very intelligent. They knew what they were doing. They would see flat areas and they would stay there, but they would suffer from whiteout, which is a very interesting phenomenon where if you're looking at the sky and the sky is pretty much white with clouds and the sun, because the sun's in an interesting position, and then the snow in front of you is white, and you're looking at nothing but white, it can actually cause blindness. So they actually used bones and made slits where it actually cut down on the glare of the snow and the glare from the sky and give them a reasonable vision that they could be able to see with. Now, hunting. What do they hunt for in the Arctic? Seal, whale, polar bear, blubber, walrus, elk, Arctic hare and fox, fish, fowl, mountain sheep. And these are some of the things that they would hunt for. But the thing is that when these Native Americans adapted, so did the animals. the animals would adapt to their environment. Their coats, their fur would actually turn white to blend into the snow. So it made it kind of difficult. Farming, well, they were not farmers. What can you farm on ice? Nothing. But they relied on gathering. And the thing is, even in the Arctic, in the harsh conditions of the Arctic, they still had many opportunities to gather nuts, herbs, bulbs, roots, berries, things that they stumbled upon, but they would preserve those. Because it's so cold, they would get these things seasonally, which meant when the ice would recede, when the ice would melt for the short and cool summer, that's where they would gather these things. They would be looking for them, they would store them, and then in the wintertime, when it became very difficult to hunt some of these adapted animals for that season, they could have these things that they gathered to rely on to meet their needs for their diet. So this wraps it up. Arctic Native Americans, stay comfortable, my friends. Stay dry, my friends. Stay warm.